Imagine spending $155 million on one of America's most famous homes only to tear it down before ever living in it. No renovations, no restoration, just complete demolition. It wasn't just another luxury mansion, it was the home of one of the most influential voices in conservative media, a place built to reflect a legacy that millions believed would last forever. So why did it vanish almost overnight? And why has the woman who inherited everything remained silent ever since? There's a quiet stretch of oceanfront in Palm Beach where one of the most famous homes in conservative America once stood. The massive estate covered 24,000 square feet, sat on 2.5 acres, featured its own professional broadcast studio, and overlooked 250 feet of private beachfront. From that studio, Rush Limbaugh spoke to nearly 27 million listeners every week. After his death, everything changed. The man who bought the property from Rush's widow paid a staggering $155 million, setting a new record for Palm Beach real estate. But instead of moving in, he tore the entire estate down before ever spending a single night there. Meanwhile, the woman who sold him the keys has remained completely silent in public for more than 3 years. Rush Limbaugh spent decades building an empire that looked like it would last forever. In the end, it was left to one person who quietly allowed much of it to disappear. Before we continue, make sure you like this video and subscribe. We bring you the hidden stories behind the people you think you already know. The real story begins with everything that no longer exists. In March 2023, billionaire William Lauder purchased Rush Limbaugh's Palm Beach estate for an incredible $155 million. The deal included 5 buildings along one of the city's most valuable stretches of beachfront and became the highest-priced home sale in Palm Beach history. Years earlier, Rush had purchased the property for less than $4 million, making the increase in value almost impossible to believe. William Lauder, executive chairman of the Estee Lauder Company, is known for buying luxury properties, but not to live in them. His pattern is simple. He buys, clears the land, and creates larger, more valuable parcels. He had already done the same thing with other nearby properties, combining them into one empty lot that was later listed for around $200 million. That made it obvious what would happen to Rush's estate. Just over a year after the sale, demolition crews arrived. The main mansion disappeared first. Its 7 bedrooms, 12 bathrooms, grand 2-story library, lavish salon inspired by the Versace style, and an elegant chandelier modeled after the famous one inside New York's Plaza Hotel were all reduced to rubble. The remaining 4 buildings followed, including the custom-built broadcast studio where Rush had hosted his nationally syndicated radio show for more than 20 years. That was the first clue that this was about much more than real estate. A record-breaking purchase ended with the complete destruction of one of the most recognizable homes in American media. At the same time, the rest of Rush Limbaugh's physical legacy was quietly disappearing. His Royal Palm Way broadcast studio, where much of his daily work had actually taken place, had already been sold in late 2022 to a Chicago investment company. Today, the historic studio is being transformed into ordinary office space where future employees may never know the history made inside those walls. Another piece of the empire vanished just as quietly. The Limbaugh letter, once the largest political newsletter in American history, had been published for nearly 30 years. Its final edition arrived in October 2021. Subscribers simply received an email directing them to a digital archive. There was no farewell announcement, no emotional goodbye, and no major tribute marking the end of an era. Every one of these decisions shared one important detail. Rush Limbaugh wasn't alive to make them. The responsibility fell entirely to one person, and within less than 2 years, she oversaw the closing of nearly every major part of the empire he had built. What makes this story unusual isn't that the empire eventually came to an end. Every empire does. What makes it remarkable is how quietly it happened. There were no headlines announcing a successor, no emotional press conferences, no ceremonial passing of the torch. One of the loudest voices in American radio simply faded away, while the buildings, businesses, and landmarks connected to him quietly disappeared. And throughout all of it, the woman making those decisions never publicly explained why. To understand who she became, we have to return to the moment America first noticed her. It was June 2010. Rush Limbaugh, then 59 years old, married Catherine Rogers, a 33-year-old event planner at the famous Breakers Hotel in Palm Beach. Their 26-year age difference immediately became a major talking point. The ceremony had a Hawaiian theme, and the guest list included some of the biggest names in conservative politics. Then came the biggest surprise. The wedding entertainment was provided by Elton John. The choice stunned many people. Elton John, one of the world's most famous openly gay performers, was singing at the wedding of a man who had publicly opposed same-sex marriage for years. Reports said Rush paid him $1 million for the performance. The unusual combination instantly became national news. Comedy shows mocked the wedding, news outlets focused on the contradictions, even a plane flew over the event carrying a banner poking fun at Rush's fourth marriage. For many people, the wedding became little more than another joke in the colorful life of one of America's most controversial radio personalities. But while everyone focused on the headlines, very few paid attention to who was actually inside the ballroom. Among the guests were Karl Rove, Sean Hannity, Rudy Giuliani, Fred Thompson, James Carville, and Mary Matalin, along with sports legends George Brett and Tom Watson. Even more surprising was the man who officiated the ceremony. Supreme Court Justice Thomas Jefferson personally led Rush and Catherine through their wedding vows before roughly 400 guests, surrounded by heavy security at one of Palm Beach's most luxurious hotels. That kind of appearance isn't something a sitting Supreme Court justice makes lightly. Behind the flashy headlines and public jokes, the relationships inside that room carried enormous political influence. Rush and Catherine had first met 6 years earlier at a celebrity golf tournament in 2004. At the time, Catherine worked as an event planner, while Rush was going through the end of his third marriage. Catherine had an international upbringing. Born in Massachusetts, she spent much of her childhood living in places like Rio de Janeiro, London, Hawaii, and the Philippines because of her father's international business career. She once mentioned that her family history traced back to John Adams, one of America's founding fathers. When asked about the large age difference between her and Rush, Catherine simply said she often found it difficult to relate to people her own age. That single comment revealed how the public would view the relationship. A descendant of a founding father marrying one of America's most controversial media figures, celebrated with $1 million Elton John performance and surrounded by some of the country's most powerful political figures. It sounded almost too unbelievable to be real.
The headlines focused on the spectacle, but once the cameras disappeared and the jokes faded, something much quieter began. Their honeymoon took place aboard Rush's private Gulfstream jet, with stops in Mexico and Africa. Within a few weeks, the media had moved on to other stories. While many people were still making jokes about Rush Limbaugh's marriage, something much bigger was happening behind the scenes. Long before anyone imagined his final years, Rush was quietly putting together a plan that would shape what happened to everything he built. Not long after their 2010 wedding, Rush and Catherine created a Florida company called Carl. The name wasn't random. It stood for Catherine Adams Rush Hudson Limbaugh, with Catherine's name appearing first. The company had only 2 members, Rush and Catherine. At first, it looked like a simple business filing. In reality, it would become the center of his entire business empire. Over time, Carl took ownership of nearly every major commercial asset connected to Rush: his nationally syndicated radio show, the Limbaugh Letter, the 2 If by Tea beverage brand, the Rush Revere children's books, speaking agreements, merchandise, and even the rights to use his name and image were all placed under this single company. Each business generated its own income, but together they formed one carefully organized portfolio controlled through a shared legal structure. After Rush passed away, legal experts noticed something important. Most of his valuable business assets were no longer owned directly by him. Instead, they belonged to the company he shared with Catherine. Because of how it was structured, ownership didn't automatically change when one spouse died. For someone whose fortune was estimated between $475 million and $600 million, that level of planning was anything but accidental. This wasn't something put together overnight. It was the kind of estate planning that takes years of legal work and careful preparation. Then came another move that only seemed significant years later. In July 2018, Rush and Catherine donated $500,000 to the Dana-Farber Cancer Institute in Boston. Around that same time, they also created the Rush and Catherine Family Foundation with an initial value of $5 million. Catherine became president of the foundation, while Rush served as treasurer. Nearly a year and a half later, in January 2020, Rush shocked his listeners by announcing that he had been diagnosed with stage 4 lung cancer. There is no public evidence showing he knew about the illness before he revealed it. Still, when people look back, the earlier charitable donations and foundation planning seem more meaningful than they did at the time. Whether intentional or simply coincidental, the timeline has raised questions ever since. When Rush died in February 2021, nearly every major asset connected to his career had already been organized through structures that Catherine controlled alongside him. There was no highly publicized estate battle, there were no children involved, and no courtroom fight over his legacy. The woman many critics once dismissed had quietly become the person holding the keys to everything. On February 17, 2021, Catherine sat behind Rush's famous golden microphone and delivered the news millions had feared. Speaking briefly to an audience of roughly 27 million listeners, she announced that her husband had passed away. She thanked his audience, called him one of the greatest broadcasters ever, and stepped away. For the next 5 months, Premier Networks filled Rush's time slot with archived broadcasts instead of introducing a replacement. Officially, it gave listeners time to mourn. Unofficially, very few people wanted to be the first person to follow one of the biggest voices in radio history. When a permanent replacement finally arrived in June 2021, it wasn't one host, it was two. Clay Travis and Buck Sexton inherited Rush's studio, the Excellence in Broadcasting brand, and the subscriber archive that became EIB 24/7. But one thing couldn't be transferred: Rush's audience. Although hundreds of stations carried the new program, other networks quickly promoted their own hosts. Dan Bongino, Dana Loesch, Dennis Prager, Charlie Kirk, and local personalities all competed for listeners who once gathered around a single voice. Instead of one dominant show, conservative talk radio became divided across multiple networks. Industry estimates later suggested that even when the audiences of several major hosts were combined, they still didn't match Rush Limbaugh's peak reach. His influence didn't disappear overnight. It simply spread across many different programs. Away from radio, another contrast was becoming clear. Rush's younger brother, David Limbaugh, began sharing stories about Rush's final months through podcasts, interviews, and opinion pieces. He spoke about his brother's faith, his battle with cancer, and the personal side of the man millions had only known through the radio. Catherine chose a very different path. She rarely spoke publicly. There were no interviews, no public disagreements within the family, and no legal disputes over the estate. David became the public storyteller. Catherine remained almost completely silent. In many ways, two different legacies emerged. One was carried through memories and public conversations. The other was reflected in ownership and long-term control of the business Rush left behind. By early 2023, much of the empire had already changed. The Limbaugh letter was gone. His Palm Beach studio had been sold. The radio audience had scattered across competing programs. Only one major piece remained. In March 2023, Catherine quietly offered the famous Palm Beach estate for sale at an asking price of $175 million. The property wasn't openly marketed through traditional listings. Instead, news of its availability spread privately through luxury real estate circles. Months later, William Lauder purchased the estate for $155 million, setting a new record for Palm Beach real estate. Not long after the sale, the mansion itself was demolished. There were no public statements from Catherine, no interviews, and no appearances as photos of the demolition circulated online. Since then, she has remained almost entirely out of public view. Reports indicate she still lives in Florida, but she has no active public social media accounts, rarely appears at public events, and has given almost no interviews connected to Rush's legacy. The Rush and Catherine Limbaugh Family Foundation still lists her as president, while Rush Limbaugh Radio Legacy LLC continues managing what remains of the commercial brand. For more than 30 decades, Rush Limbaugh built one of the most recognizable voices in American broadcasting. Yet, after his passing, the empire he created slowly transformed through careful planning, private decisions, and quiet management. In the end, perhaps the biggest surprise wasn't who inherited everything. It was how quietly one of the largest media empires in conservative radio faded from public view after the voice that built it was gone.